From the outside, it might seem as though the idea for one of New York's grandest residences was born from nothing more than the whims of a wealthy industrial leader. But the truth is far more intricate. Charles M. Schwab was a figure shaped by contrasts, a man whose roots were grounded in modest Pennsylvania towns, yet whose ambitions grew in step with the steel empire he helped command. As the 20th century approached and Manhattan surged upward in steel and stone, Schwab felt an undeniable pull to leave his own mark on the city, not through another factory or corporate tower, but through a residence that would stand as a physical statement of what the Gilded Age believed about itself. He wanted a home that told the world he had climbed not just the ranks of industry, but the very architecture of American aspiration. The thought of building a mansion on Fifth Avenue would have been the obvious path, because that was where the city's titans clustered, where old money families secured their legacy through limestone facades and manicured courtyards. Yet that predictability irritated Schwab. He had never been the sort of man who followed pre-written scripts. He preferred bold moves, unexpected strategies, and gestures that hinted at his confidence rather than his conformity. Fifth Avenue was already claimed by the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Goulds. A palace there would blend into a parade of grandeur that had already been documented, measured, judged, and repeated. Schwab wanted something that existed outside those boundaries. This desire for distinction drew his attention westward, toward the quieter, less developed slopes along the Hudson River. Riverside Drive was nothing like the polished elegance of Central Park's eastern edge. It was rougher, younger, full of untapped potential, a stage waiting for a visionary. The more Schwab looked at the gentle curves of the riverbank, the more he sensed that a residence here would not simply stand out, but dominate the view, rising like a beacon over the water. In those days, the Upper West Side was considered too distant from the heart of society, an eccentric choice for someone with his social standing. Friends murmured that it was too removed from the traditional centers of influence. But that only strengthened his conviction. If Fifth Avenue represented the past, Riverside Drive represented the future, and Schwab wanted to anchor that future with something monumental. He imagined a home that did not just reflect success, but reshape the skyline around it. He wanted a structure that would make even Andrew Carnegie, his former mentor, and a man not easily impressed, stop and wonder. The idea was not born merely from pride, but from a restless energy, a desire to fuse art, architecture, and industrial-era ambition into a single statement. Every major figure of the Gilded Age had found a way to display power, but Schwab envisioned a residence that would embody the intensity of the era in a way no building had yet attempted. The more he planned, the clearer his vision became. This would not be a house built to whisper luxury. It would proclaim it from its foundation. It would not sit politely among other mansions. It would tower above them in scale, materials, and imagination. It would offer not just comfort, but spectacle, not just rooms, but experiences. Riverside Drive offered the canvas he needed. Open space, panoramic river views, and the freedom to build without constraint. Here, he could create a home that would be talked about not just by his contemporaries, but by future generations who would marvel at what the Gilded Age dared to do. And so, in the quiet corners of his mind, the idea grew from a spark into a mission. Schwab did not want a residence. He wanted a landmark, a palace that would redefine what a private home could be. One so grand in scale and detail that even the giants of Fifth Avenue would seem modest beside it. In that ambition, the first stone of the Charles M. Schwab Mansion was laid long before the ground was ever broken. The search for the perfect piece of land became the moment when Schwab's dream stopped being a private fantasy and began taking shape as a tangible project. He was not looking for convenience or proximity to established elites. He was seeking a place where a palace could rise unchallenged, where no neighboring facade would diminish its effect, and where the structure could occupy the horizon like a crown. With that intention, he walked through Manhattan not as a resident, but as a cartographer of ambition, scanning the island for an untouched frontier worthy of his vision. When he first arrived at Riverside Drive between 73rd and 74th Streets, he encountered something that felt unlike any other part of the city. The land sloped gently toward the Hudson, creating a sweeping vista that expanded the moment one stepped toward the river's edge. It was quiet, shockingly quiet, for a city that had already begun its march toward becoming a global metropolis. Carriages passed occasionally, children played on uneven patches of grass, and the wind carried the scent of river water instead of coal smoke. There was no parade of grand mansions here, no architectural competition, no rigid hierarchy of old families watching newcomers with suspicion. In this openness, Schwab saw an opportunity others refused to acknowledge. At the time, the Upper West Side was viewed as a gamble for anyone of serious social standing. The eastern side of Central Park boasted refined brownstones and mansions inherited across generations. The western side was still in transition, dotted with scattered estates, undeveloped lots, and emerging rows of townhouses. Society pages whispered that it was a district for strivers, not a stage for legends. But this uncertainty, this blankness, appealed to Schwab more than stability ever could. He felt that building in a place with no precedent allowed his home to become the precedent, an anchor that would reshape the character of the entire neighborhood. Still, Schwab was not the only one whose decision mattered. His wife, Urena, whose social world was built around Central Park's glittering balls and gatherings, hesitated at the idea of abandoning the familiar rhythms of the East Side. For her, the proposed location felt remote, almost detached from the pulse of high society. She feared that moving into a district still taking shape would gradually pull her away from the lively salons and gatherings that had become part of her identity. The worry was not trivial. For someone who had adapted to her husband's rising fortunes with grace and loyalty, the idea of social isolation was genuinely unsettling. Schwab addressed her concerns not by downplaying them, but by promising something more compelling. He assured her that the home he planned would become such a magnet of fascination that no distance would deter their circle. People would travel across the city not just to visit, but to experience the grandeur inside. He envisioned soirees where the Hudson shimmered behind enormous windows, where orchestras played in halls designed for resonance, and where guests would speak of the house on the river with an awe usually reserved for royal estates. It was not a relocation he was offering her. It was an invitation to build a new center of gravity, a place where society would come to them, not the other way around. Standing on the grass between 73rd and 74th Streets, he understood something with absolute clarity. The success of his mansion would depend not on how close it stood to established power, but on how boldly it redefined the idea of prestige. The river itself became part of his imagined architecture, its reflective surface, its seasonal moods, its vastness stretching westward like an endless promise. The site's isolation was not a flaw, it was a frame that would amplify the impact of whatever rose upon it. The decision to purchase the land marked a turning point, not only in Manhattan's architectural trajectory, but in the destiny of the mansion itself. A palace placed on Fifth Avenue could have become one elegant facade among many, admired today, but overshadowed by its neighbors tomorrow. But here, on Riverside Drive, it would stand alone, unmatched in scale, unchallenged in silhouette, and impossible to overlook. The choice of land ensured that the mansion would dominate the skyline from the moment it was built, and that its story, whether triumphant or tragic, would be inseparable from the landscape that shaped it. In choosing this unconventional stretch of Manhattan, Schwab effectively rewrote the map of influence. His decision set in motion a transformation of the Upper West Side and determined, long before the foundation was laid, that the mansion's future would be as dramatic and unforgettable as the man who dared to build it. When the land had finally been secured and the riverfront future of the mansion was no longer a dream but a commitment, Schwab turned to the next question. Who could bring such an audacious vision to life? New York was overflowing with established architects whose portfolios brimmed with grand facades and celebrated townhouses. Yet, Schwab's instinct pushed him away from the obvious choices. He was not searching for someone who already had a legacy. He wanted someone who could build theirs alongside his. That search led him to Morris Henry Herbert, a name that barely resonated within the architectural circles of the era. To most observers, selecting Herbert seemed reckless, almost naive, but Schwab was known for spotting potential long before others saw it. Herbert possessed something that mattered more to Schwab than reputation, a mind unburdened by the rigid expectations of tradition. Established architects of Fifth Avenue had mastered refinement, but Schwab wanted innovation, an approach that could fuse European grandeur with modern American ambition. Herbert's early sketches revealed a rare willingness to explore bold proportions, dramatic symmetry, and sculptural detail without being chained to any single style. His fresh perspective matched the daring tone of the project, and Schwab sensed that an architect still striving for recognition would fight harder to deliver something extraordinary. Together, they began shaping a design that refused to blend into any existing category. The earliest drawings were ambitious but restrained, echoing elements of classical architecture without pushing boundaries too far. Yet, as conversations deepened, as Schwab described his desire for a residence that would be both a private sanctuary and a public marvel, the sketches began evolving. Herbert experimented with increasingly imposing facades, sweeping terraces, elevated entrances, and towering roofs that framed the sky like a ceremonial crown. The structure grew not simply outward but upward in imagination, taking on the presence of a palace rather than a home. It was during these explorations that the spirit of the Beaux Arts style began to crystallize, a fusion of ancient Roman inspiration, Renaissance symmetry, and the theatricality of French Academy architecture. Herbert transformed these influences into a coherent vision, layering details that felt both timeless and boldly contemporary. Columns no longer served as mere decoration. They became visual anchors. Carved reliefs told silent stories across stone surfaces. Balconies curved with the grace of European châteaux, while the massive foundations conveyed the power of industrial age engineering. Schwab pushed for more of everything. More sculptural drama, more majestic stonework, more interplay between shadow and light on the rising walls. He wanted the mansion to reveal itself step by step, offering new impressions with every angle. Herbert responded with drawings that grew in complexity, facades ornamented with intricate scrollwork, towers where light could spill into interior rooms, broad windows that framed the Hudson as if it were painted onto glass. The design transformed from an ambitious blueprint into an architectural challenge unlike anything New York had attempted in a private residence. As the final concept emerged, it became clear that the mansion would not simply borrow from the Beaux-Arts tradition, but reinterpret it with American confidence. The building would blend classical structure with advanced engineering, bringing together old-world artistry and modern technology in ways that reflected Schwab's life in the steel industry. The exterior would radiate European elegance, while the interior would function with the efficiency of a finely tuned machine. By the time the last preliminary sketch was laid on the table, the mansion had stopped being a theoretical project. It had become an architectural giant in waiting, its foundations imagined as deeply as its future halls. The design captured everything Schwab sought: prestige, innovation, spectacle, and promised to reshape the image of Riverside Drive forever. Once the plans had reached their final form, the property transformed from a quiet patch of earth overlooking the Hudson into a vast coordinated construction zone where noise, dust, and ambition blended into a single rhythm. What unfolded over the next 4 years pushed the limits of early 20th century engineering and demanded a level of coordination typically reserved for major civic projects, not a single private residence. Yet the mansion was never treated as a house. It was treated as a monument, and everything about its construction reflected that philosophy. The first deliveries of pink-granite arrived like ceremonial offerings. Massive blocks quarried and shipped over great distances began to accumulate on the site, turning the once open landscape into a temporary stone city. Workers carved, polished, and lifted each block into place with precision that seemed improbable given the technology of the time. The density and weight of the stone meant progress was slow, each piece demanding immense physical effort. But Schwab insisted on using it for its durability and the soft, regal tint it cast when the sunlight hit it from the west. He wanted the mansion to greet the river with a warm glow each evening, as though the structure itself acknowledged the day's end. The number of laborers working on the project ebbed and flowed, but at its peak, the site resembled a small industrial village, masons-shaped blocks with rhythmic strikes that echoed across the water. Carpenters built towering scaffolds that wrapped around the structure like temporary exoskeletons. Blacksmiths sharpened tools and forged metal fittings on the spot. Skilled artisans arrived from across the country: sculptors, tile layers, decorative metal workers, each specializing in a craft that would appear in some corner of the finished residence. The air was filled with the scent of cut stone, the clang of steel on granite, and the murmur of dozens of languages spoken by workers brought together by one extravagant commission. As the walls climbed higher, the mansion revealed how far ahead of its time it truly was. Schwab was determined that the house should not merely look modern. It should operate with a level of innovation that would impress even the most seasoned engineers. One of the earliest and most ambitious components was the installation of a private power plant within the building's footprint, a bold move when most homes relied entirely on city grids. Generators were housed in a specially constructed area beneath the mansion, ensuring a steady supply of electricity that would illuminate chandeliers, power machinery, and control environmental systems long before such conveniences became commonplace in private residences. Equally remarkable was the inclusion of a fully functional air conditioning system. At a time when most families relied on open windows and handheld fans for relief, Schwab sought climate control on a grand scale. Engineers developed a sophisticated network of ducts, vents, and cooling chambers that would maintain comfort throughout the sprawling interior. This required careful coordination with the mansion's structure, as the system had to be integrated discreetly so that no mechanical element disrupted the visual harmony of Herbert's design. The installation of multiple elevators further underscored the mansion's technological daring. These were not simple freight lifts, but elegant, smooth-operating elevators designed to move residents and guests effortlessly through the home's many levels. To ensure reliability, the shafts were reinforced, the machinery tested repeatedly, and the controls designed with redundancy in mind. Visitors accustomed to climbing stairs in even the wealthiest homes would find themselves transported between floors as though the mansion were a modern hotel or grand public building. As each year passed, the structure grew more imposing, its silhouette gradually taking shape against the skyline. Neighbors and passers-by watched a residence rise that seemed disproportionately large, even for the ambitions of New York's elite. Industry leaders, including Schwab's former mentor Andrew Carnegie, visited the site out of curiosity and left in astonishment. Carnegie, a man famously difficult to impress, reportedly stared in disbelief at the scale of the project. If his own mansion represented refinement and discipline, Schwab's construction embodied audacity and a willingness to outstretch every known standard. By the time the final stones were placed and the scaffolding removed, the mansion had already secured its reputation. It towered above Riverside Drive with a confidence that bordered on theatrical, as though aware of the effort and innovation that had brought it to life. The 4 years of relentless building had transformed a simple stretch of Manhattan into the stage for one of the most extraordinary private residences the city had ever seen, marking the beginning of a legacy that would draw eyes, admiration, and eventually, tragedy. From the moment the last scaffold pole was taken down, the mansion revealed itself as something so visually commanding that even seasoned New Yorkers stopped mid-stride to absorb what stood before them. It didn't simply dominate Riverside Drive, it transformed it. The facade stretched across the sloping land like an elaborate stage set carved from pink granite, its sheer mass softened by the artistry woven into every visible surface. The house communicated power without saying a word, projecting a presence that felt almost ceremonial, as though one had stumbled upon a royal residence rather than a private American home. Across the exterior, a symphony of architectural languages unfolded. The influence of French châteaux announced itself immediately in the dramatic rooflines, steep pitches, and turreted forms that framed the sky with an almost theatrical flourish. These shapes evoked the Loire Valley, where aristocratic estates stood as testaments to dynasties centuries old. Herbert borrowed these gestures intentionally, not to mimic the past, but to elevate the structure beyond any single cultural reference. To stand before the mansion was to feel as if Europe had been distilled, magnified, and then reinterpreted through the lens of American ambition. The grandeur deepened as the eye traveled from rooftops to walls, where Roman sensibilities emerged through the disciplined symmetry of the design. Perfectly proportioned wings balanced each other as though held in tension by an invisible thread. Massive columns anchored entrances with the dignity of ancient temples, their fluted surfaces catching afternoon light and casting soft shadows that shifted throughout the day. The central portico, with its classical pediment, suggested both stability and invitation, a threshold where the worlds of public admiration and private luxury converged. Yet it was the Greek details that gave the mansion its emotional depth. Sculptural friezes stretched across sections of the upper facade, their scenes frozen in marble-like relief. Mythological figures, floral patterns, and ornamental motifs wrapped around windows and doorways, as if the building had been shaped by storytellers as much as by artisans. Each carving contributed not just decoration, but narrative, allowing the structure to communicate a silent mythology of its own creation. Visitors and pedestrians alike found themselves drawn closer, compelled to inspect these details as though deciphering fragments of an ancient tale. Complementing the stonework were dozens of sculptural elements that punctuated the exterior with unexpected personality. Lions crouched along balustrades, their expressions sharpened with remarkable precision. Caryatids appeared to shoulder sections of upper balconies, their stylized drapery flowing in expertly carved folds. Cherubs perched atop archways, gazing down with the playful confidence of figures fully aware that they were part of something extraordinary. These weren't simple ornaments. They were flourishes that elevated the mansion to the realm of architectural storytelling, making the building feel alive from every angle. As pedestrians approached the mansion from the north or south, the structure shifted visually with each step. The rounded corners softened its monumental scale, disguising transitions between wings with curves and sculptural treatments that guided the eye smoothly along the length of the facade. Windows were placed in purposeful rhythms, alternating between grand arched frames and more restrained rectangular forms. This rhythmic arrangement created a sense of motion, suggesting that the building itself breathed and stretched across its terrain like a living entity. No matter where someone stood, the house presented a slightly different personality, a hallmark of truly masterful design. Sunlight played a vital role in the mansion's visual performance. At dawn, the pink granite glowed with a muted warmth, giving the structure an almost ethereal softness. By midday, the stone sharpened into cooler tones, emphasizing the crisp edges of its carvings and the depth of its shadows. As evening approached, the setting sun transformed the mansion into a glowing monument, its western windows reflecting the shimmering Hudson, as though the entire facade had been dipped in gold. Even after nightfall, the mansion continued to captivate. Soft exterior lighting allowed key architectural elements to emerge from the darkness, giving the residents a presence that felt both regal and slightly mysterious. The effect of this architectural masterpiece was immediate. Carriages slowed as they passed. Locals shifted their walking routes just to glimpse it again. Visitors from other boroughs traveled to Riverside Drive simply to see the house that newspapers were already calling one of the most extravagant private residences in the nation. For the first time, Manhattan's spotlight shifted westward, away from the predictable elegance of Fifth Avenue and toward the bold silhouette rising above the Hudson. The mansion didn't just enhance the neighborhood, it redefined it, pulling the gravity of the city ever so slightly toward the river. In a metropolis filled with ambition, where skyscrapers were rising and fortunes were multiplying, the Charles M. Schwab Mansion managed to do something rare. It impressed a city that prided itself on being unshockable. It became a new landmark without needing approval, a point of fascination that reshaped not just the skyline, but the very identity of Riverside Drive. Approaching the mansion from the outside already prepared visitors for something extraordinary, but nothing could fully anticipate the effect of stepping through its doors for the first time. The entrance sequence was designed with deliberate psychological precision, crafted to guide the senses from admiration to awe with every movement forward. Schwab understood that the true power of a residence lies not just in its facade, but in how it shapes the experience of those who cross its threshold. He wanted each guest, whether a steel magnate, a foreign diplomat, or a curious socialite, to feel the same unmistakable sensation, that they had entered a world where scale, luxury, and artistry converged so completely that their own presence seemed to shrink in comparison. The ascent began outside, where a series of wide granite steps rose gently toward the main entrance. These steps were not simply functional, they were ceremonial, intentionally broad and shallow, so that each one extended the moment of anticipation. As guests climbed, the mansion revealed itself layer by layer. The columns loomed higher, the carved pediment above the door sharpened into view, and the massive bronze entrance doors, intricately molded with botanical and allegorical motifs, grew larger with every step. The act of climbing became a subtle but powerful prelude, a transition from the ordinary world of Manhattan's streets into the private universe of the Schwabs. When the heavy bronze doors opened, they did so with a smooth, almost theatrical glide, revealing the grand entrance hall beyond. It was a room designed not merely to impress, but to overwhelm through proportion alone. The ceiling soared so high that voices softened instinctively, swallowed by the vastness above. Marble columns flanked the space, polished to a reflective sheen that caught the glow of chandeliers suspended like floating constellations. Each column's base was adorned with sculpted figures and leaves, grounding the grandeur in intricate human craftsmanship. The floor beneath guests' feet was a mosaic of colored stone, assembled piece by piece into patterns inspired by Roman villas and Renaissance palaces. These designs were not meant to be noticed at a glance. They were built to reward those who paused, allowing their eyes to travel the swirling pathways and geometric forms that stretched outward like maps of forgotten empires. Together with the towering ceiling and the echoing acoustics, the hall made visitors feel as if they had stumbled into a cathedral of wealth rather than a private home. From this immense space, the eye was inevitably drawn toward the grand staircase, an architectural statement that dominated the hall with audacious confidence. The staircase began as a broad, triumphant sweep of polished stone before dividing into twin flights that curved upward like the arms of an embrace. The banisters were carved from dark, lustrous wood, their railings shaped by artisans who had spent months perfecting the fluid lines and ornamental flourishes. As guests climbed, the vantage point shifted, revealing murals on the walls that depicted mythological landscapes washed in soft, golden hues. The staircase did not merely lead to the upper floors, it elevated the viewer's role in the mansion's unfolding drama. Moving deeper into the interior, visitors encountered a series of interconnected halls and antechambers that acted as both physical and emotional buffers between the entrance and the private rooms beyond. Each space offered its own layer of grandeur. Some halls were lined with Corinthian pilasters and framed by arches trimmed with gilded moldings. Others featured soaring niches filled with sculpted figures or decorative urns displayed on marble pedestals. Even transitional spaces, areas that existed only to lead from one room to the next, were imbued with enough detail to function as standalone works of art. The scale of the house became more pronounced the further one moved from the entrance. Doors reached nearly twice the height of an average person. Corridor ceilings stretched upward with unexpected height, refusing the humble vocabulary of ordinary homes. Every threshold marked a shift not in style, but in magnitude, reinforcing Schwab's original intention: to envelop guests in a sense of insignificance before a structure that existed on a scale far beyond traditional domestic architecture. Yet, despite the overwhelming size, there was a rhythm that guided movement. Every line, sculpture, molding, and entryway was positioned with intention. Herbert's design ensured that the eye always had somewhere compelling to travel, from a statue's marble gaze to a gilded ceiling panel, from a carved mantelpiece to a distant arched doorway framed in light. This choreography softened the shock of the mansion's enormity, replacing confusion with fascination. Guests often slowed their steps without meaning to, caught by details that pulled them into moments of quiet contemplation. For Schwab, this was the entire point. He believed that power should not be shouted but quietly asserted through scale and refinement. The mansion's entrance sequence embodied this philosophy perfectly. By the time a visitor reached the central hall beyond the staircase, where the house's true wonders awaited, they had already been transformed. The world outside felt smaller, their footsteps quieter, their awareness sharpened. The mansion had successfully performed its first task: to take each guest, no matter how influential, and remind them that in this palace of stone, light, and imagination, they were entering a realm ruled entirely by grandeur. Stepping beyond the grand staircase brought visitors into the true heart of the mansion, where the building stopped being a powerful architectural statement and became a world of intimate marvels. Each of the 75 rooms held its own identity, its own atmosphere, and its own story, forming a sequence of carefully orchestrated environments that revealed the mansion's soul piece by piece. The deeper one ventured inside, the more apparent it became that this was not a residence created to impress in one sweeping gesture. It was designed to unfold like a journey, each room acting as a chapter in an ever-expanding narrative. The first rooms encountered beyond the central hall were the grand salons, spaces where sunlight streamed through towering windows and danced across polished marble floors. Their proportions were magnified to feel both majestic and welcoming, with ceilings adorned in frescoes that depicted allegorical scenes rendered in soft blues, golds, and earthy reds. These frescoes were crafted by European-trained artists who spent months perched on scaffolds, their brushes moving with meticulous care as they layered pigments into visions of myth, history, and nature. The salons contained hand-carved mantels imported from France, tapestries woven with shimmering threads that shifted hue depending on the light, and furniture upholstered in fabrics sourced from workshops known only to the most elite collectors. Even the scent of the room, warm with beeswax polish, subtle florals, and the faint tang of old wood, added to the sensory depth. Connected to these salons were quieter, more reflective spaces that contrasted with the grandeur of the public rooms. One of the most striking was the library, a sanctuary cloaked in deep mahogany that wrapped the walls from floor to ceiling. Embedded within the woodwork were delicate carvings of vines and leaves, creating a sense that the room grew organically from the mansion itself. Rows of leather-bound volumes lined the shelves, their spines aged to tones of burgundy and forest green. The air carried the comforting aroma of ink and paper, warmed by the glow of a massive fireplace, whose mantel was topped with marble figures representing the muses. A glass-paneled ceiling above the central reading area allowed natural light to spill downward, making the space feel as though it hovered between the serenity of a garden and the intellectual richness of a scholar's retreat. This room was more than a place for reading. It reflected the thoughtful side of Schwab's world, the part of him that sought knowledge even as the world celebrated his wealth. Nearby, winter gardens stretched along the mansion's southern side. These spaces were designed to defy the seasons, offering an eternal spring encased in glass and steel. Sunlight filtered through expansive skylights, nourishing exotic plants, orchids from tropical climates, towering palms, and ferns with delicate fronds that filled the air with a fresh, earthy fragrance. Pathways of mosaic tile twisted between the greenery, creating meandering routes where guests could stroll beneath hanging vines and hear the soft trickle of small fountains. In the winter, when Manhattan winds tore at the river outside, these gardens became warm refuges, fragrant with blooms and alive with color, while the rest of the city lay dormant beneath frost. The mansion's private areas carried a different energy, shaped for comfort, but crafted with the same devotion to artistry. Schwab's personal study was a cavern of dark woods, heavy draperies, and deep armchairs arranged near a window overlooking the Hudson. Here, the river became a silent companion, its waters reflecting the shifting moods of the sky. A large desk rested at the far end, its surface carved with geometric patterns and inlaid with mother-of-pearl. This was where Schwab contemplated investments, corresponded with industry leaders, or simply retreated from the weight of public life. In contrast, Urana Schwab's boudoir shimmered with lighter tones. Pastel silks, mirrored panels, soft carpets, and walls adorned with hand-painted scenes of gardens and butterflies. The room radiated warmth and grace, serving as both dressing chamber and personal sanctuary. A delicate chandelier hung above, its crystal droplets catching the slightest movement of air and scattering light like fragments of sunrise. The doors of her private wardrobe concealed gowns, hats, and delicate lace imported from the finest European houses, arranged with the precision of a museum display. Scattered throughout the mansion were countless smaller rooms, each crafted with intent. Music rooms where string quartets performed beneath coffered ceilings. Smoking rooms lined in dark leather and brass. Butlers' pantries hidden behind sliding doors with polished copper fixtures. Guest bedrooms decorated in rich jewel tones, each with its own distinctive personality, so no visitor felt like an afterthought. Even the hallways themselves were experiences, with walls lined in silk damask, floors inlaid with patterned woods, and ceilings adorned with plaster medallions or painted skies. What unified all these spaces was the sense that the mansion was not merely a showcase of exquisite craftsmanship, but an expression of identity, a reflection of Schwab's belief that life could be lived not just comfortably, but spectacularly. The rooms were designed to transport, to surprise, to engage, to make every guest question where the boundary between a home and a palace truly lay. Each one revealed a facet of the house's character, as though the mansion possessed its own personality. Warm in some rooms, dramatic in others, contemplative, theatrical, serene, extravagant. Exploring these 75 rooms was like wandering through a tapestry of worlds stitched seamlessly together. The mansion communicated in textures and colors, in the echo of footsteps across polished stone, in the gleam of sunlight against gilded friezes, in the softness of carpets woven by artisans across the ocean. It was a place where space became emotion, where architecture became storytelling. And in every room, whether grand or intimate, one felt the same truth. This was a house built not just to be lived in, but to be experienced. At the center of the mansion, beyond the libraries, salons, and private chambers, the architecture shifted into a different register, one defined not by intimacy or contemplation, but by performance. These were the rooms where the mansion revealed its true theatrical nature, crafted for spectacle, movement, and the carefully orchestrated choreography of high society. Schwab wanted his home to function as easily as a grand stage as it did a residence. And nowhere was this intention more vividly expressed than in the vast halls that formed the beating heart of the estate. The grand ballroom, the crown jewel of these spaces, stretched across an entire wing of the mansion with a scale that rivaled the great halls of European palaces. Its ceiling soared high above the polished floor, painted in sweeping frescoes that depicted celestial scenes, swirling clouds, radiant light, and mythological figures that looked down on guests like guardians of a timeless pageant. Crystal chandeliers descended from the painted heavens, each one engineered to dispel a constellation of light across the room. When the chandeliers were illuminated during evening events, they transformed the ballroom into a galaxy of shimmering refractions, casting moving patterns on the marble and silk below. The walls were lined with gilded pilasters, their carved capitals supporting balconies where musicians performed during formal gatherings. The acoustics were engineered so precisely that even a soft melody from a violin could reach the farthest corner of the room without distortion. And when orchestras swelled into dance music, the entire hall vibrated with an almost physical rhythm. Guests would glide across the floor, which was polished to such a mirror-like sheen that dancers appeared to be floating above their own reflections. Everything about the ballroom was designed to magnify beauty, exaggerate movement, and amplify the grandeur of any event held within it. Connected to the ballroom was an art gallery that extended in a long, luminous corridor, displaying a curated collection of paintings, sculptures, and rare decorative pieces. Soft, diffused lighting allowed each artwork to stand out without overwhelming the senses. The gallery wasn't merely a place to admire masterpieces, it was a ceremonial pathway. Guests often walked through it before entering the ballroom, absorbing the visual splendor as a prelude to the festivities ahead. The lingering smell of oil paint and polished frames gave the corridor an almost museum-like atmosphere, a reminder that the house itself was a living exhibition. Perhaps the most surprising of the grand spaces was the chapel theater, a hybrid room that reflected Schwab's fascination with both spirituality and performance. Its arched ceiling and stained glass windows evoked the quiet dignity of a sacred space, but the layout, with its small stage and exceptional acoustics, gave it a dual purpose. Concerts, intimate recitals, and private gatherings were held here, illuminated by warm pools of colored light passing through the stained glass. The atmosphere was mesmerizing, a fusion of reverence and drama that made each performance feel like a ritual. Visitors often spoke of this room as one of the most enchanting in the entire mansion, where silence carried the weight of emotion and every sound felt amplified by the room's intricate geometry. Deeper within the mansion, the architectural drama shifted from the ethereal to the extravagant. A full-sized indoor pool sat beneath a ceiling of glazed brick tiling that reflected soft blue light across the water's surface. Columns wrapped in iridescent tiles lined the edges, creating the impression of a luxurious bathhouse from a forgotten empire. The air was warm and fragrant with clean mineral scents, and the ripple of water echoed gently against the polished walls. This pool was not simply for leisure. It was a demonstration of technological sophistication, heated and maintained through systems far more advanced than anything found in most homes of the period. Nearby, a private bowling alley extended under arched beams, illuminated by lantern-style fixtures that cast warm circles of light along the lanes. The clatter of rolling balls and tumbling pins created a lively soundtrack whenever the Schwabs entertained guests. It was an unexpected delight, a blend of recreation and architectural elegance that turned a simple pastime into a luxury experience. Adjacent to the alley were rooms dedicated to sport and health, workout chambers equipped with state-of-the-art equipment, massage rooms, and areas designed for fencing, boxing, or calisthenics. The mansion treated wellness as both an indulgence and a performance, offering spaces where guests could admire not just art and architecture, but physical vitality. Every one of these rooms served a dual purpose, entertainment and display. They allowed Schwab to showcase the full extent of his wealth and innovation, but they also reflected his desire to create a world where life itself could be elevated into an art form. The mansion became a stage upon which evenings of music, dance, conversation, and leisure unfolded with the regularity of grand productions. In these magnificent halls, with their gilded details and resonant acoustics, the boundary between social gathering and theatrical spectacle dissolved. Visitors entered as guests and found themselves immersed in a performance that seemed to exist only within the walls of this extraordinary home. In the heart of the mansion, wealth became atmosphere, architecture became choreography, and every event, from a glittering ball to a whispered conversation beside the gallery walls, took place in a setting designed to magnify the drama of human presence. Here, the building fulfilled its ultimate purpose, not just to shelter life, but to elevate it. Beyond the glittering public rooms and theatrical halls, the mansion concealed an entirely different world, a hidden infrastructure that made the entire estate function with the precision of a grand ocean liner or a state-of-the-art institution. These spaces were rarely seen by visitors, yet they represented some of the most revolutionary engineering of the era. Schwab believed that true luxury was not only what guests could see, but also what they never needed to think about. Comfort delivered seamlessly, service executed invisibly, and technology integrated so deeply that it felt like magic. The result was a labyrinth of mechanical ingenuity, a secret zone that allowed the mansion to operate as a self-contained ecosystem. At the core of this unseen realm was the private power plant, a marvel tucked beneath the mansion like a mechanical heart. While most homes depended entirely on New York City's rapidly expanding electrical grid, Schwab insisted on full autonomy. Rows of generators, turbines, and switchboards filled an underground chamber engineered to remain cool and well ventilated despite the heat they produced. The plant supplied electricity to chandeliers, elevators, climate systems, and even specialized lighting in the art gallery, ensuring that no blackout or technical failure in the city could ever interrupt life inside the house. Engineers maintained the equipment around the clock, monitoring gauges, replacing parts, and ensuring the system ran with the consistency of a finely tuned engine. The steady hum of machinery was barely audible upstairs, shielded by layers of stone and insulation, but it powered the brilliance witnessed above. The mansion's ventilation and climate control network was equally advanced. What seemed like pleasant, naturally regulated air in the public rooms was actually the product of a complex system routed through concealed ducts and vents. Air was drawn in through hidden intakes, filtered, cooled, or warmed depending on the season, and distributed throughout hundreds of feet of corridors, parlors, and private chambers. The system was astonishing for its time, one of the earliest comprehensive climate systems in an American residence. In the winter, it created a gentle, even warmth that drifted through the mansion without the dry harshness of radiators. In summer, it delivered cool, refreshing air to rooms that would otherwise have sweltered beneath stained glass ceilings and heavy draperies. The invisible precision of this network allowed the mansion to maintain an atmosphere of comfort that felt effortless, even during Manhattan's most extreme weather. Connecting many of the mansion's most critical operational areas was an intricate network of service corridors and underground tunnels. These passageways formed a hidden city beneath the grand floors, allowing staff to move swiftly from one part of the home to another without ever disturbing guests. The tunnels were lined with stone, lit by electric lamps, and wide enough for servants to carry trays, linens, or even small carts loaded with supplies. Some corridors connected directly to delivery entrances, ensuring that goods could be brought into the house without ever crossing paths with the social life above. Others led to storage rooms where groceries, wines, and fresh produce were kept in carefully controlled conditions. Efficiency was the guiding principle. The house flowed like a well-managed institution, but without the noise or chaos that such efficiency usually required. At the heart of this network lay a kitchen so technologically advanced that it resembled a production facility more than a domestic workspace. Massive ranges lined with polished steel stood beside oversized ovens capable of preparing banquet meals for hundreds. Vent hoods swept fumes upward into dedicated ducts, preventing even the faintest trace of cooking smells from reaching the public rooms. Refrigeration units, still considered new and luxurious at the time, stored meats, dairy, and fruits in perfect condition. Prep stations were arranged in a sophisticated workflow, allowing teams of chefs and assistants to move seamlessly from washing to chopping to cooking without ever interfering with one another. The kitchen operated with the speed and precision of a luxury hotel, yet it remained a hidden force, seldom seen by guests who later marveled at the dishes served in the dining hall. Above the kitchen, in the more discreet wings of the mansion, lay the quarters for the staff who brought the house to life each day. These rooms were modest but surprisingly comfortable, reflecting Schwab's belief in providing respectable living conditions for the people who sustained the estate's operations. The corridors here were lined with uniform doors leading to bedrooms, common rooms, and small washrooms. Each space was efficiently lit and well ventilated, a far cry from the cramped, dim, and often airless servant quarters found in many contemporaneous mansions. A dedicated staircase and a service elevator allowed staff to move between floors discreetly, ensuring that guests saw the results of their labor without ever witnessing the labor itself. This hidden infrastructure was the mansion's silent genius. Guests admired the cool air on summer nights without knowing the machines that created it. They marveled at the smooth ascent of the elevator without seeing the maintenance crews who kept its cables perfectly aligned. They praised the flawless timing of meals without glimpsing the synchronized ballet of cooks and servers working behind closed doors. Schwab's home appeared to function effortlessly, but beneath the beauty lay an astonishing amount of planning, foresight, and engineering. In these hidden spaces, the house revealed its second identity. Not just a palace of luxury, but a triumph of logistics and mechanical innovation. It operated with a level of autonomy unmatched in the United States, blending the elegance of a European chateau with the precision of modern industrial power. Here, in the mansion's secret zone, the future quietly hummed beneath the past, creating a harmony that defined the estate's most remarkable achievement: the mastery of comfort delivered invisibly. Stepping from the mansion's interior into the surrounding grounds felt like entering an entirely different world, one that seemed almost impossible to find in the middle of Manhattan. Schwab understood that the power of a residence lay not only in its rooms and halls, but also in the landscape that framed them. For this reason, he enlisted Charles Leavitt, one of the most visionary landscape architects of the era, to transform the sloping land along Riverside Drive into a private Eden. Leavitt approached the project not simply as a garden design, but as the creation of a living extension of the mansion itself, a green realm that softened the stone's imposing presence and offered sanctuary from the rapid pace of the expanding city. The estate unfolded in a series of layered terraces, each meticulously shaped to complement both the natural topography and the architectural grandeur of the house. Rather than flatten the landscape, Leavitt embraced its contours, sculpting paths and platforms that flowed with the natural rise and fall of the terrain. These levels created distinct outdoor rooms, each with its own atmosphere, view, and purpose. From the upper terraces, visitors could gaze across the Hudson River as it shimmered in the afternoon light, watching boats glide past and clouds drift lazily above the opposite shore. The river became an ever-changing mural, offering a visual calm to counterbalance the city's relentless energy. Interwoven among these terraces were gardens designed with an artistic sensibility equal to the mansion's interior. Sculpted lawns stretched out like velvet, bordered by carefully chosen trees that blended native species with exotic varieties. Tall elms offered deep shade during the summer, while clusters of flowering shrubs filled the air with subtle fragrances as the seasons shifted. Stone pathways, edged in intricate mosaics, wound through these landscapes, leading guests on gentle strolls where each turn revealed a new perspective. A fountain framed by climbing roses, a marble bench nestled beneath an arch of wisteria, a statue half hidden by foliage that seemed to appear only when the light struck a certain way. Statues played a significant role in Levitt's design, chosen not as ornamental afterthoughts, but as sculptural punctuation points throughout the grounds. Some depicted mythological figures that echoed the mansion's classical motifs, while others portrayed allegorical forms symbolizing art, knowledge, or prosperity. These works were positioned with a keen sense of drama, a figure gazing toward the mansion, another looking out to the river, still another placed in a shaded corner where it invited contemplation. The statues gave the gardens a sense of quiet narrative, as though the grounds told stories parallel to those unfolding within the house. Connecting the gardens were elegant staircases carved from the same pink granite as the mansion, creating a seamless visual continuity between architecture and nature. These stairs flowed into flagstone paths lined with lantern posts that glowed softly at night, illuminating the estate with a warm, golden light. In the evenings, when the lanterns flickered and the river reflected the last traces of sunset, the grounds took on an almost dreamlike atmosphere, a blend of cultivated beauty and natural serenity rarely found in an urban setting. Along the southern edge of the property stood the orangeries and conservatories, glass structures framed in delicate ironwork that housed citrus trees, tropical plants, and year-round greenery. Inside, the air was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of lemon blossoms and damp earth. Rows of potted plants lined intricately tiled floors, while a network of overhead pipes maintained precise humidity and temperature. In winter, when Manhattan's winds cut sharply along the Hudson, these glass houses remained vibrant oases where the warmth of sunlight filtered through translucent panels and illuminated leaves like stained glass. The conservatories were not merely functional structures, they were showcases of botanical luxury, celebrating nature as an integral part of the mansion's identity. The entire landscape acted as a buffer against the city beyond its borders. Trees and hedges were strategically planted to block noise from passing carriages and, later, early automobiles. Dense plantings along the perimeter created the illusion that the mansion existed miles from any urban environment. Birdsong replaced street sounds, the rustle of leaves softened the world's intrusions, and the views of the river provided a sense of openness that contrasted sharply with the tight grid of Manhattan streets nearby. Even longtime residents of the city often found themselves startled by how quiet the estate felt, as though they had stepped outside the boundaries of Manhattan entirely. In these gardens, the mansion revealed its softer side, the side that sought balance, reflection, and harmony with nature. While the interior boasted power and spectacle, the grounds offered tranquility and escape. Leavitt's design transformed the estate into a sanctuary where the stresses of city life dissolved into the rhythm of water, wind, and greenery. The mansion did more than stand above Manhattan. It breathed alongside it, shielded by a green cocoon that preserved its majesty from the restless world beyond. At first, the great halls and luminous salons of the mansion seemed destined to remain alive forever, filled with movement, music, and lavish celebration. But as the years passed, a subtle shift began to settle over the estate, a shift so quiet at first that it blended into the rhythms of daily life. The grand rooms that once pulsed with orchestras and the soft flutter of silk gowns gradually grew still. Conversations that once echoed against marble surfaces faded, until the only voices heard were those of servants passing through distant corridors. The mansion, built to be a symbol of vitality and triumph, slowly transformed into something far more somber. A palace whose grandeur could no longer conceal its deepening loneliness. The decline began not with a single dramatic event, but with a gradual change in the Schwab's social world, as Charles's business ventures became more unpredictable, and his personal life more turbulent. The stream of guests that had once flowed freely into the ballroom and salons started to thin. Invitations extended by the Schwabs carried less excitement than they once did. Rumors swirled around Charles's extravagant habits, the high-stakes gambling, the impulsive spending, the affairs whispered about behind closed doors. Even those who still admired him grew cautious, unsure whether associating too closely with his increasingly risky lifestyle was wise. Slowly, the circles that had once revolved around the mansion shifted elsewhere, leaving its vast rooms underused and its grandeur increasingly hollow. Inside the house, the change was palpable. The grand staircase, once a stage for shimmering gowns and the soft hum of evening chatter, became a silent monument to events that no longer occurred. Dust gathered more easily along its banisters, and the chandeliers above were lit less frequently, their crystals reflecting entire nights of stillness. The ballroom, once the mansion's pulsing heart, grew especially haunting in its quiet. Without orchestras filling the air, the room felt startlingly large, its ceilings impossibly high, its walls echoing even the slightest footstep. What had once been built to hold hundreds now held nothing but the memory of movement. The emotional center of this growing solitude was Urania Schwab. Her transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Once a radiant presence at social gatherings, she began to retreat from public life, withdrawing into the privacy of the mansion, with an intensity that worried those who remembered her earlier warmth. The very home that had been promised as a vibrant hub for her social world became the place she avoided most. The rooms she had once filled with laughter now saw her only in brief, somber passes. Her desire to host gatherings diminished, replaced by a preference for quiet corners and curtained windows that shut out the sparkling city beyond the garden walls. As her world contracted, her spirit seemed to dim. The weight of expectations, whispers about her husband, and the isolation brought on by their changing fortunes all contributed to her growing detachment. She moved less through the central halls and more through hidden corridors, choosing solitude over spectacle. The mansion, with all its shimmering surfaces and ornate detailing, no longer felt like a place of celebration to her. It became a shelter she rarely escaped, a silent refuge that grew heavier with each passing year. Guests who occasionally visited during this period spoke of an atmosphere that felt strangely frozen in time. They described rooms impeccably maintained, yet devoid of life, as though the staff were caring for a relic rather than a home. Fires burned less often in the grand fireplaces. Music, once a constant presence, vanished entirely. The winter gardens still bloomed beneath their glass ceilings, but only the gardeners walked their paths. Even the river seemed quieter when viewed from the library windows, its gentle movement a stark contrast to the stillness inside. Servants became the unseen custodians of this silence, moving through the mansion with careful steps, aware that the house's grandeur had turned into something fragile. Their work ensured that the estate kept its outward beauty, but they could feel the emptiness settling deeper into the walls. Some described the house as though it were breathing differently, slower, heavier, as if mourning the loss of the life it once held. What had been built as a lively palace of abundance was becoming a vast and echoing prison, not through bars or locked doors, but through the weight of disuse and growing sorrow. Rooms designed to be filled with elegance and light now held only shadows and the quiet shuffle of footsteps too few to sustain their purpose. The mansion remained magnificent in form, but its spirit, once bright with celebration, had begun to fade. This was the first unmistakable sign that the glorious trajectory of the Schwab Mansion was turning toward a fate its creator had never envisioned. When the First World War cast its shadow across nations and cities, even the private world of the Schwab Mansion could not remain untouched. The grand residence, once devoted entirely to luxury, celebration, and the rhythms of high society, found itself pulled into a global crisis that demanded sacrifice from everyone, including those whose lives had once been defined by abundance. For the first time since its completion, the mansion's gilded rooms would serve a purpose far beyond showcasing wealth. They would become a refuge, a workplace, and a beacon of service at a moment when the world desperately needed compassion. It was Urania who initiated the transformation. Though she had retreated from social life, the war awakened something in her that had long been quieted by isolation. She opened the mansion's doors to the American Red Cross with a calm determination, offering its vast halls and spacious rooms as sites for relief efforts. In doing so, she allowed the house to shake off its stillness, even if only temporarily, and take on a new identity, one rooted in service rather than spectacle. The transformation of the mansion into a wartime operations center was both swift and surreal. Rooms that had once hosted glittering soirees were repurposed with practical urgency. The grand ballroom, accustomed to sweeping gowns and orchestra rehearsals, was reorganized into an assembly area where volunteers prepared bandages, clothing bundles, and care packages destined for soldiers overseas. Long tables replaced the polished emptiness of the floor, covered with medical supplies, rolls of cotton, and crates marked for shipment. The ceiling frescoes depicting celestial dramas looked down on a different kind of activity now, one defined by purpose rather than performance. In the adjoining gallery, where guests once strolled leisurely past artworks and delicate sculptures, volunteers sorted donated goods, cataloged supplies, and organized deliveries for families in need. The soft, diffused lighting that had once highlighted fine art now illuminated rows of parcels, handwritten notes, and carefully packed tins of food. The change was stark, but it gave the space a new kind of beauty, one born of quiet diligence and collective goodwill. The chapel theater, once a sanctuary for music and reflection, became a training space where women learned essential skills to support wartime efforts. Sewing machines, charts, and instructional materials replaced the elegant seating. The stained glass still cast its warm colors across the room, but now those colors danced across uniforms being stitched, first aid kits being assembled, and volunteers practicing essential medical procedures. The soft hum of machines blended with the occasional murmur of instruction, creating a soundscape that felt hopeful rather than somber. Even the winter gardens took on a new life. Their warm, humid air and filtered sunlight made them ideal for storing perishables and preparing food for relief efforts. Volunteers moved among the orchids and palms, their footsteps echoing faintly against the tile pathways as they organized meals for local families whose loved ones were serving abroad. The conservatories, once symbols of refined leisure, became vibrant centers of activity, green sanctuaries both in beauty and in purpose. Throughout this transformation, the mansion maintained its dignity. Volunteers who entered often paused in quiet amazement at the merging of grandeur and service. Marble columns soared above donation tables. Crystal chandeliers sparkled softly over rows of volunteers stitching bandages. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, embracing this temporary identity with a solemn grace. Its architectural magnificence did not diminish the seriousness of the work. Instead, it elevated it, as though reminding everyone that even the most extravagant spaces could rise to the demands of history. This period breathed new life into the estate, but it also revealed a poignant contrast. The rooms were full again, but not with music, dancing, or lavish displays of wealth. Instead, they were filled with focused hands, determined faces, and the quiet resolve of people serving a cause far greater than themselves. The mansion, once designed to impress, now offered comfort and support. It stood as a shelter for those working tirelessly to send relief across an ocean. Yet, beneath this renewed activity lay the awareness that the house's original purpose was slowly slipping away. The mansion could adapt to change, could rise to meet a crisis, but it could not escape the reality that its golden age was fading. The grandeur remained, but its context had shifted forever. In serving the world beyond its walls, the house revealed its generosity, even as it sensed the first distant tremors of the decline that would eventually reshape its fate. When the 1920s drew to a close, the mansion still stood with the same imposing confidence it had always possessed, its pink granite glowing softly in the late-day sun. But, beneath the surface, fractures were forming, not in the stone, but in the world that had once made such a residence possible. The Great Depression arrived like a sudden storm, sweeping away industries, fortunes, and certainties with a force that few had ever imagined. As markets collapsed and companies faltered, the Schwab Mansion, a palace built on ambition, spectacle, and the wealth of a booming era, found itself drifting into dangerous waters. For decades, the cost of maintaining the estate had been staggering, but manageable. The staff, the gardens, the electricity, the repairs, the expansive systems hidden beneath the floors, all of it required a constant stream of money. But when the Depression struck, that stream dwindled to a trickle. Charles Schwab, once celebrated as one of America's great industrial minds, saw his financial stability weaken at a terrifying pace. Investments that had once seemed secure turned unreliable, and business ventures that had previously been bold now appeared dangerously exposed. The mansion's opulence, once a source of pride, became a daily reminder of costs he could no longer easily carry. Expenses mounted relentlessly. The heating bills alone were enough to sustain several ordinary homes. The gardens demanded continuous attention. The climate systems required constant upkeep. The elevators, the lighting, and the private power plant were expensive to operate and maintain. Rooms that had once glowed with activity now sat dark to save electricity. Whole wings were closed off, the furniture covered, the fireplaces left cold. The mansion that had been designed to impress guests at every turn now seemed far too large for the shrinking world of the Schwabs. In desperation, Schwab made a decision that would have been unthinkable in earlier years. He put the mansion up for sale. The asking price, though significant, represented only a fraction of what he had invested into its creation. He hoped that another industrial leader, a rising tycoon, or perhaps an institution seeking a grand headquarters, might see value in the estate's size and craftsmanship. The listing promised a house unmatched in New York, a structure with 75 rooms, sweeping terraces, commanding river views, and technological marvels woven through every floor. On paper, it was an extraordinary offer. But the world had changed. The very features that made the mansion magnificent, its scale, its intricate design, its luxury, were now liabilities. At a time when businesses collapsed, banks failed, and families struggled to afford basic necessities, the idea of purchasing and maintaining a palace of this magnitude seemed almost absurd. Potential buyers balked not at the asking price, but at the upkeep. It was an estate built for an age of unrestrained confidence, not for a nation struggling to regain its footing. The mansion lingered on the market, year after year, gathering dust both literally and figuratively. Those who toured it walked through its grand halls in quiet awe, but their admiration was tempered by practicality. They saw the marble floors and soaring ceilings, and envisioned the bills that would accompany them. They admired the gardens, but pictured the workforce needed to maintain them. They marveled at the private power plant, but understood the cost of keeping such machinery alive. Even the city government, approached with proposals to convert the estate into an official residence or administrative building, declined. The house, they argued, was too ornate, too extravagant, too expensive for any public use. With no buyers and no relief in sight, Schwab's situation deteriorated further. The man who had once commanded steel empires now paced through silent corridors that echoed his every step. A king wandering through a kingdom no longer supported by its own wealth. The mansion, once a symbol of triumph, now reflected the precariousness of his position. Each darkened room, each closed-off wing, each idle fireplace felt like a quiet reminder that the era which birthed this house had passed. Gradually, the estate's grandeur became overshadowed by its emptiness. Servants were dismissed as the household tightened its resources. Repairs were postponed. The gardens grew less immaculate. The house never fell into true disrepair. The staff that remained kept it dignified. But the difference was noticeable. The sparkle of its golden years dimmed, and the mansion took on a melancholy beauty, like a stage awaiting actors who would never return. In these years, the true beginning of the end emerged. The mansion was no longer a living masterpiece, but a relic of a Gilded Age collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Schwab, who had once envisioned a palace that would stand forever as a testament to his success, now faced the heartbreaking truth. The world he built the mansion for no longer existed, and the house itself was too enormous, too intricate, too demanding to survive without the tide of prosperity that had created it. The storm of the Great Depression had not only shaken the nation, it had reached the doors of Riverside Drive, stripping the mansion of the financial foundation that had sustained its grandeur. And as the years crept forward, its fate grew more uncertain, setting the stage for the final chapters of its extraordinary and tragic story. By the early 1930s, the mansion that had once radiated life, elegance, and theatrical brilliance had fallen into a stillness so profound that it felt almost otherworldly. From the outside, Its massive silhouette still dominated Riverside Drive, its pink granite catching the afternoon light just as beautifully as it always had. But inside, a quiet transformation had taken place, one that stripped the house not of its architecture, but of its heartbeat. The palace built to astonish had become a hollow monument, echoing with memories instead of music. The decline unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A few rooms were shut to reduce maintenance. Then entire wings were sealed. Corridors that had once guided streams of guests, servants, and musicians were now traversed only by the occasional caretaker carrying a lantern, their footsteps muffled by dust that settled over the carpets like a thin winter frost. Curtains remained drawn to save the fabrics from fading, leaving many of the rooms cast in a dim twilight, even during the brightest hours of the day. The grand staircase, once the ceremonial spine of the mansion, stood motionless beneath chandeliers that no longer sparkled at full brightness. Furniture began to disappear piece by piece, not through carelessness, but necessity. Items were sold discreetly: rare chairs, gilt-framed mirrors, imported tapestries, each sale a quiet admission that the mansion could no longer sustain the illusion of abundance. In the ballroom, where hundreds had once danced beneath painted skies, the absence was almost startling. The polished floor, now dulled by neglect, stretched out like an empty plain. Dust motes hung in the air, drifting slowly through the beams of muted light that filtered through the tall windows. Without music or movement, the room felt vast in a way it never had before, as though it were expanding into the silence. Artworks vanished next. Paintings that once looked down from gilded frames were removed, leaving faint outlines on the walls, pale rectangles where sunlight had never touched. Sculptures disappeared from their pedestals, leaving behind cold circles of discolored marble. Even the soft murmur of airflow seemed quieter, as though the mansion itself was exhaling with resignation. Each missing object created a new emptiness, a new reminder of how far the house had drifted from its magnificent beginnings. In private quarters, the sense of abandonment was even more palpable. Schwab's study stood stripped of its books and personal treasures, its massive desk cleared of papers, its cabinets emptied. The river view that had once offered him solace now framed a scene of quiet separation. A man at the end of his era, preparing to leave behind the greatest symbol of his ambition. Urena's rooms were equally barren, their silks and mirrored vanities gone, the soft glamour that once defined them replaced by stark stillness. By the mid-1930s, the mansion existed in a state of eerie limbo. It was maintained only enough to prevent decay, but not enough to feel alive. Servants who had spent decades caring for the estate moved on, and their absence left behind a haunting sense of displacement. Without footsteps, without voices, without the subtle hum of daily routines, the house felt like a sleeping giant, too magnificent to be forgotten, yet too empty to be saved by its own beauty. The final turning point came in 1939, when Charles Schwab packed the last of his belongings and left the mansion for a modest apartment on Park Avenue. His departure marked more than just a change of address. It was the symbolic closure of an entire era. The man who had once imagined the mansion as a living testament to his success now walked away quietly, leaving behind a structure that had outgrown even his ability to sustain it. The house, once filled with light, laughter, and the bustling energy of ambition, now remained behind him like an abandoned stage after the final curtain. With Schwab gone, the mansion stood in a state of dignified abandonment. Its windows reflected the seasons in silence. Its gardens grew more unruly. Its rooms, still structurally magnificent, felt colder with each passing winter. City officials deliberated over possible uses for the enormous property, debating whether it could serve as an official residence, an institutional headquarters, or a cultural center. But every proposal eventually faltered. The mansion's grandeur, so breathtaking in its prime, now proved to be its greatest obstacle. It was too ornate for government use, too vast for practical conversion, too costly to maintain, and too architecturally specific to adapt easily to modern needs. By the end of the decade, the city had quietly accepted a painful truth. The mansion, once one of Manhattan's greatest triumphs of design and engineering, could not be saved in its original form. Its fate no longer rested in the hands of its creator, its caretakers, or even its admirers. It rested in the logic of a city that was evolving rapidly. shedding old skins and preparing to carve new paths across its ever-shifting landscape. The palace on Riverside Drive stood alone, regal and sorrowful, waiting for a decision it could not influence, a silent witness to the end of the world that had built it. By 1948, the mansion's fate was no longer a matter of speculation, but a fixed sentence. The city that had once marveled at its grandeur now viewed the enormous estate as a relic from a world that no longer existed. Manhattan was transforming at breakneck speed. Land was too valuable, housing too urgently needed, and the economic realities too unforgiving for a single private palace, especially one that had stood empty for nearly a decade, to justify its footprint. And so the decision was made. The Charles M. Schwab Mansion would be dismantled piece by piece, its legacy reduced to salvage and memory. The demolition began quietly, without fanfare or ceremony. Crews arrived in early spring, their equipment stark and utilitarian against the mansion's ornate facade. Pink granite that had taken years to assemble now cracked beneath hydraulic pressure. Ornate cornices, carvings, and sculptures that had once seemed eternal were lowered on cranes or shattered during removal. As work progressed, the estate that had symbolized the pinnacle of Gilded Age ambition slowly collapsed into heaps of rubble and exposed steel. The silence that had haunted the mansion in its final years was replaced by the clatter of machinery and the sharp rhythms of chisels breaking stone. Yet even in destruction, parts of the mansion were deemed too precious to discard. Preservationists, clergy, and private collectors identified elements worth rescuing before they vanished forever. The massive mahogany doors, adorned with intricate carvings, were removed with painstaking care and transported across the East River to Brooklyn, where they found new life in the entrance of Our Lady of Lebanon Cathedral. Marble pilasters, their surfaces polished and veined with age, were also salvaged for the cathedral's interior, giving the sacred space a touch of the lavish artistry that once defined Riverside Drive. Portions of the ironwork, sections of stained glass, and some surviving decorative pieces were taken by those who recognized the architectural value of a house that could no longer stand. Inside, as rooms were gutted, fragments of the once splendid interiors emerged like archaeological discoveries. Mosaic tiles that had lined the winter gardens, frescoed ceilings now splintered by beams, decorative moldings still holding traces of gold leaf. Some pieces were rescued, many more were lost to the debris that piled in the mansion's shadow. Objects that had once been priceless heirlooms of craftsmanship now disappeared into history, scattered across salvage yards or discarded in landfills. Only the photographs taken during the demolition captured how abruptly the estate's beauty dissolved into dust. When the last stones were cleared and the site leveled, construction began on a new kind of structure, one designed not for spectacle, but for practicality. Rising quickly from the flattened grounds was a large red brick residential complex that would become known as the Schwab House. Its appearance contrasted sharply with what had come before: functional, square, efficient, and unmistakably modern. The new building offered hundreds of apartments, a far cry from the 75-room palace that had once stood in its place, where sweeping staircases and carved balustrades had once guided guests into a world of opulence. Now modest lobbies and uniform balconies greeted ordinary residents going about their daily lives. The transformation reflected not just a shift in architecture, but a shift in priorities. Manhattan in the mid-20th century valued density over display, utility over extravagance, and the promise of affordable living over the preservation of private empires. The Schwab Mansion, once hailed as a triumph of artistic ambition, now seemed like an indulgence incompatible with the city's urgent needs. Those who advocated for preservation were too few, too late, and lacking the political influence required to save the estate. Practicality won, and New York moved forward, leaving the remnants of the mansion buried in the memories of those who had known it. As decades passed, the story of the mansion faded from public consciousness. The Schwab House apartment complex became just another part of the city's landscape, its name offering only the faintest echo of the grandeur that once stood beneath it. New generations walked those streets unaware that beneath their feet had once risen a palace of pink granite, crowned with sculpted figures and filled with frescoes, music, and marvels. What remains of the Schwab Mansion now exists almost entirely through photographs. sepia images of the ballroom's soaring ceilings, black and white snapshots of the gardens glowing under sunlight, and demolition photos capturing the heartbreaking moment when magnificence crumbled under the weight of progress. These images preserve a version of Manhattan that no longer exists, a reminder that the city's evolution often demands the sacrifice of treasures whose value becomes clear only after they're gone. In the end, the mansion's legacy is not found in stone or steel, but in the story it left behind. A story of ambition and artistry, of triumph and loss, of a home that soared higher than its era could sustain. It stands now as a vanished giant, a legend scattered across archives, remembered by historians, and mourned by those who wish the city had held on to just a little more of its former splendor.